Good morning. Welcome to St. Sarkis Church. I'm happy to see all of you here, my dear brothers and sisters. This past Friday evening, we had a session of Salt and Light. We had mainly the junior members attending, and we decided to bring them up here and have a discussion with them. And I had asked one of our facilitators, Mrs. Janet, to do an icebreaker. And she had come up with a very interesting icebreaker, a question that would make the attendees think. The question was, who would you take with you if you knew that you were facing, or the world was facing a fatal calamity? I think she was trying to say, who would you take with you if this was the end of the world? And our members of Salt and Light, they were really good. They came up with really good answers. Some said God, others said Jesus. Some said my mom, my dad, my good friend. One person said Mary, and then she asked me the question. She said, Derhard, who would you take with you if you knew that it was the end of the world? I said, Deacon Bedig, and everyone was surprised. Why Deacon Bedig, they said. I said, because if he comes with me and he has his purvar and the khung, the incense, the devil will start coughing and sneezing and the calamity will stop, obviously. So today I want to start a little bit light because we're going to talk a little bit about darkness. And, end of the world is a very dark thing. But we don't have to wait for the end of the world to happen to start thinking about darkness. Darkness is something that we can experience. And historically, when we look at the life of our saint, St. Gregory, the Illuminator, the time that he spent in the Khor Virab, the dark pit, sometimes I would imagine, what was it like for him to come out back to the light after that long stay in Khor Virab? Must have been very difficult. One of the movies, and today again we're talking about movies, I got a lot of positive feedback from last week's sermon, by the way. One of the movies that, again, in the 90s, and this shows me that, in the 90s I was spending a lot of time watching movies, was The Man in the Iron Mask. That moment when Leonardo DiCaprio, they take him out of the jail cell, and then they remove the mask from his face. That moment, it's really very, very powerful. He's seeing the light for the first time after a very, very long period of time being in darkness. That's a very powerful transformation. And there are so many people who physically are experiencing darkness even today. And when I say this, I'm thinking about all the people who are still in captivity from Artsakh in the Azeri prisons, and my heart goes to them. But the darkness is not always physical. The darkness sometimes is emotional, and a lot of times darkness is spiritual. And today, the Bible narrative tells us about a person who was in that state of darkness. Today we read about that well-known encounter of Jesus with a person who was from the ruling class, the Pharisees, whose name was Nicodemus. And he comes to Jesus by night, and he starts a conversation with Jesus. The fact that John, who is very precise with his words, he tells us that Nick, can we call him Nick? Or we should stay with the formal name, Nicodemus. The fact that Nicodemus comes to him at night, it wasn't like that Jesus' schedule was full all day. He was having one appointment after another that Nicodemus had to wait until he finished all his appointments that he could see Jesus. But it tells us that Nicodemus was in that state of darkness spiritually. And Jesus was pulling him out of that darkness, inviting him to the place of light. And it sounds like it's a casual conversation. Nicodemus tells Jesus, We see that you are a person who comes from God. No one can do these signs that you are performing unless God is with him. It's an open-ended kind of statement that he makes. And Jesus tells him, truly, truly, I tell you, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must be born again. You must be born new. This is the statement that Jesus makes. Basically, he tells him that the doors of the kingdom are open, but you have to make an adjustment. You have to change. Now, we have to spend a few minutes here just trying to explain the idea of what Jesus is saying. When we go to the Greek translation, Jesus is saying, you must be born from above. And in the Armenian language, it is the same thing. Verestin. What does verestin mean? A lot of times we think noren, again. But verestin, it's the same word, verenzanil. So Jesus is saying you need to be born from above. So sometimes I wonder, is Jesus saying that we need to change our perspectives? And we need to start looking into heavenly things? This is something that I would like you to think about for a minute. One of my favorite Psalms says, I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the maker of the heavens and the earth. I'm looking at my text because I know the Psalm in Armenian. To raise your eyes above to the hills, to the mountains. And in the scripture, that's a language that says, I'm trying to find God. I'm looking up. Think about it for a minute, guys, especially the young ones here. How often do we look up? We spend our time and our days looking down and gazing on the screens. We're always busy with something. And we don't know the effect of what we're doing, the negative effect of what we're doing day after day in our lives. Today's biblical narrative and the message encourages us to change something essential and to start looking up. Because God has a different perspective. And when we start looking at things from that heavenly perspective, things start looking different in our lives. So I'd like you to remember this psalm. I lift my eyes to the hills. Lift your eyes to the hills. If you're spending every moment of your day gazing at what your devices, your smartphones, your tablets are feeding you, maybe you're failing your own identity. Jesus tells Nicodemus that you need to be born new, you need to be born again, you need to be born from above. And then Nicodemus asks a follow-up question, how can that happen? I'm an old man. Or do you expect me to go back into my mother's womb and be born? And Jesus says, you must be born of water and the Spirit. Whatever is born of flesh is flesh, but whatever is born of spirit is spirit. Now, Jesus tells us clearly that to be born new is a very mysterious part of our journey, of our Christian journey. God had a message to his people in the Old Testament. And when people received God's message, when they received God's invitation, they had to show that by a sign. And the sign at that time was the sign of circumcision. In the New Testament, that is changed by the baptism. And the baptism is our response to God's invitation. Are we accepting God's invitation? If the answer is yes, early Christians were baptized. Their entire families were baptized. And that is why we encourage that we also baptize our children as soon as possible. Now, a lot of people object to this practice and say, what does the child understand when we baptize them when they are really very young? They need to grow up, and they need to understand, and they need to make a conscious decision if they want to practice this faith or not. Well, that's one way of thinking. But I personally do not believe in that. And I think that's a very dangerous way of thinking. If my parents waited for me and said, we're going to let our son to grow up and get to an age of 14, 15, maybe 18, so that he can decide what he wants to practice. You know, as a person who was born in the Middle East, does he want to be a Christian, a Sunni Muslim, a Shiite Muslim, a Jew? Can you imagine? We knew who we are. Our parents knew who they were. And it was really very important that they would transmit that to the next generation. Identity, it's not what I think of myself. There are certain things that are given. It goes from parents to the children. And baptism is our identity. And it's not that moment that we spend here, we take a lot of good pictures and then we go and then we have khorovats and we celebrate. That's not it. This is the beginning of the journey. But we also believe in renewal. Last Sunday, today, and the following Sundays after Easter, the church is inviting us to embrace that message of renewal. Renewal happens at different ages of our lives. Speaking of my life personally, I can pinpoint to the major events where real spiritual transformation happened in my life. And I'm grateful for those moments of transformation because they were moments of maturity in my life. But I don't think that I would have those moments if it hadn't been for that initial clear understanding of my identity, that I am an Armenian Christian, baptized in the church. This is where we practice our faith. Is our church perfect? No, absolutely not. But can we find God here? Oh yeah, absolutely. This is the essence of the message of renewal. And one final thought. If Nicodemus were to encounter Jesus today in the 21st century, I would imagine that the conversation would sound something like this. Jesus, I've read the New Testament, and I know that there are a lot of good teachings that you provide. The message of love, the message of that everyone is being equal is good. The morality in the New Testament is pretty good. But is there anything more than that in your message? And I would imagine Jesus saying that there's a lot more than that. That is just the surface. Because when you immerse yourself deep, when you allow me to love you, there's redemption and there is full life. My brothers and sisters, don't minimize the message of the New Testament as a message of love and, good social teachings, etc. The message of the New Testament is much, much bigger than that. And if you have not experienced it, Jesus tells you with the words of the gospel, you must be born again, you must be born new. There's an internal transformation that needs to happen in your lives.